Hi, and welcome back to my shop. I'm really moving along now on my screen door project. And what I did is I went ahead and actually did the joinery on one side of the door. And then I'm just gonna take my layout marks from this side, transfer them to the other side of the door, and then I'll show you exactly how I managed to cut all the joinery. What I did is I went and used my Domino XL to put 2 tenons in my bottom rail, and then I've put 1 tenon in the center of each of these additional rails. And you won't be able to see it from this camera angle, but I did make one little pencil line where the center of each tenon needs to go. So I'm going to use those pencil lines to then transfer those same marks to the other side of the door, and that'll ensure that my rails are nice and parallel to one another and square to the sides. And I'll just give you a little bit of a close-up look here of what the joinery looks like once it's done. So here is my floating tenon, and it's sitting inside that rabbet. And then I also have a mating rabbet here and the mortise that receives the other end of that floating tenon. So everything kind of fits together nice and snugly. But the key here is I do actually cut all the mortises before I cut these rabbets. So I'll show you exactly how I did that. So here I have one of my rails. And again, since I've already cut one side, I've already got a shoulder defined at this rabbet. So I'm just going to drop my tape measure in there, measure across 25 3/4. And that's where my other shoulder needs to be cut. And then I know that the depth of each of these rabbets is another 1/2 inch. So essentially I just add another 1/2 inch to that mark, and that's where I need to make my final cross cut. Now you just saw me use, a carpenter's tape measure to do that layout, and you might think, well, Rob, that's really not a fine-tuned, highly accurate measuring instrument in the shop. And you're right, it's not. But this is a screen door that is going to have to get fit into an opening, so it's not even going to be square when it's done. So the absolute length doesn't have to be dead on to the micron. But what is important is that every single one of these rails is the exact same length, and that'll ensure that I actually have a nice square and true door when I'm done. Now, ordinarily, I would just use my miter sled on the table saw, but I've already got my table saw all set up with my dado stack because I'm using that to cut the rabbets once these joints are complete. And I don't want to mess with that because it's already dialed in. So I just improvised a little bit. I took a piece of cut off oak here, and I just double stick taped it onto my miter saw fence. And then down here, I also taped on a stop block. So I just laid this down, slid it right up against that stop block, and have it nice and tight against my fence, and made sure that my mark lined up with the inner teeth of my miter saw. So that's going to ensure that I make the cut at the right spot on this first one, and then every subsequent piece I'll just drop on here, slide back against this makeshift stop, and cut it. It took me about 4 minutes to put together, and that's why I always keep lots of double stick tape on hand in the shop for things like this. Now that I have my pieces cut to length, my last step is that I just need to transfer, somehow get the center line from this end all the way down on this end as well, and then that's basically just going to be where the other mortise gets cut to line up with my marks on the style here. So the easiest way to do that, I thought about like all these crazy ways of trying to transfer it, but all I really need to do is make sure I'm registering off the same side each time. I put my combo square up there so that my mark is right at the edge. Just flip it back around, again registering against that same edge, and tighten that up and just make my mark like that. So that means that my center mark is exactly in the same place on this side as it is on this side. That'll match the mark I made here so that I know everything lines up spacing wise, and then I'll be able to start cutting my joinery. Now, the reason that those center marks for each of the mortises are so critical is because of the way the Domino XL works. Now, you can, if you want, you can use these stops to register your mortises off an edge. But in this case, it's going to be very difficult to do that, especially on the longer piece, because there's really nothing for me to register off of. So the other option when using the Domino XL is it does have this clear window in the top with this little black line in the window. So all I have to do is drop this down, square it to the top, and align that black line with my pencil mark right inside that window. And it's actually incredibly accurate. It sounds like it might be a little bit up to chance just because you're visually making this match, but it actually works incredibly well. So that's all there is to it, and then I've got this thing already set in to dial in the right depth of the mortise, and I've just ganged all of these rails together so I can just go boom, 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 boom right down the line and cut all of my mortises on these, and then I'll just mount the stile and do the same thing. Now I'm just repeating the same process on the stile. If you've watched any of my episodes in the past, you know that I like to idiot-proof as much as possible to avoid making mistakes on a project like this, especially once I've gotten this far. So I've got all of my mortises drilled and lined up for all of my rails and stiles. So the last thing I need to do to fit everything is to actually cut the final rabbets. So what I'm doing is I'm making a chalk mark on each edge that's going to receive a rabbet. So effectively I'm going to be removing the chalk lines. So I need to have rabbets on the tops and the bottoms of each of these middle dividers because I'm going to have screen fitting in there. And then of course I need to have a rabbet along the inside edge of this stile. And then the bottom piece receives a rabbet just on the top, but not on the bottom. So you can see how once you start running these through all the machinery, it'd be really easy for me to accidentally flip this one upside down or invert it and cut my rabbet on the wrong side. So I want to do everything I can to make sure that I do this right. Now these pieces also, these will receive a rabbet on the back edge here. So I'm also going to put just that little stripe on the back edge. And that way I know if I'm not removing a chalk line, then I'm about to cut a rabbet in the wrong spot. I mentioned earlier that I couldn't use my table saw to cut my rails to final length because I already had the dado stack set up and ready to go. So that's kind of the beauty of this operation. I'm going to be cutting all of the long grain rabbets, so any of the pieces where I'm cutting that long rabbet, I'm going to do it on the table saw with the dado stack. It's by far the safest and easiest method to do that, especially for those 80-inch long stiles. And then I'm going to switch over to the router table to cut the end grain rabbets that go on the individual rails, which I'll show you next. First, I just need to cut all of my long grain rabbets. So here is my wide bottom piece. See, my chalk line is here, so I know that I need to flip it over and run it through this way. Then I can just come over to the router table and cut the end grain rabbet. And actually, in retrospect, I should probably cut the end grain rabbets first, just in case I do get any tear out in that end grain. That'll get cleaned up when I cut the long grain rabbet. So that's probably the better order to do these in. I just happen to start at the table saw. But for the rest of these, I think I'll reverse that order. I also do have a sacrificial fence that I've been using here, and that also helps reduce any tear out or blowout when this thing goes through the other edge. And again, looking for that white chalk mark so I know that side goes down no confusion, idiot proof. And then I'll just run it through. I've gone ahead and fit in my number 2 and number 3 rail, and they fit nicely. The reason I fit these two first is there's one last step. If you recall in the design, I actually have a divider that splits up this middle piece to sort of model after the front door of my house. So once I've got those fit in, I've already cut my mortises on these 2 rails, and I have my center marks already cut. So I already know exactly where this needs to match up with. All I need to do now is determine what the actual final length needs to be. So the easiest way for me to do that, again, is use referential measurement. So all I have to do is sort of drop this in so that the top touches the inside here, and then I can just make a mark on the other side, and that tells me the final length this needs to be, and then I just need to cut the rabbets to finish it off. I made sure that before putting my tenons in, I dry fit each of the joints to make sure that I had a nice clean fit. I did actually end up running both of the styles through my table saw and dado stack one more time, pushing really tight against the fence, because there were a few areas where there was enough variance that I was leaving a little bit of a gap in the joinery, and that really cleaned everything up. So that was really the only issue that I ran into. So now I'm just doing a dry fit. I've got all of my tenons into the rails, and then I've just got clamps on either end, and I'm just going to slowly work these clamps down, and as each one of these reaches the next tenon, I'll just make sure to slide it in place and keep clamping down. And if I keep working from both ends, I should be able to drive this thing home. This is a great advantage to having the twin screw vise at one end, and then I also have dog holes in the top of my bench on the sides, so I can actually sit this on these bench dogs, clamp it into the twin screw. It actually gives me a great way of working on this sort of vertically. In fact, if this works well enough, I may even use this same approach to do my glue up. Okay, so I have pulled everything back apart, and I have everything set up to go. I am gonna assemble this and glue it up vertically on my bench, as I kind of suspected. I have each of the rails laid out 1 through 5 so that they're in the right order. That will prevent any screw-ups there. The other thing I need to remember to do is glue up my middle stile between the 2 and 3 before I can attach the 2 and 3. But in order to sort of maximize the speed of this process, what I'm going to do is put glue on half of each of the floating tenons. I've even marked the equator of each one of them. And then I'll put them into the stiles halfway in, because the clock really isn't ticking yet at that point. That glue can start to set, and that won't affect my glue up at all. Once I have all those in, then I'll put glue on the other half and then start putting each of the rails in place, and then I'll put the right-hand piece on the top and then clamp everything together. So hopefully that will kind of give me the most efficient method for assembling this so that I can get everything done within the open time of my glue. Now I am going to be using Titebond 3 because that's a waterproof glue, and that will work best for an outdoor application like this. So hopefully I have everything working in my favor, and I'll be able to get this glued up without having any gaps that set in before I can actually get the clamps on. I got my door out of clamps now. I'm happy with the results. It's very sturdy and very solid because of that floating tenon joinery that I used. And I also did lay this flat on my bench, and it did remain extremely flat throughout the process, which was really a primary concern of mine. So next, I really need to think about the trim that I'm going to use to conceal where I'm going to tack in the screening. And then of course I also have to put the screening in place as well. But I also want to consider that it might be a lot easier for me to apply the finish, or at least most of the finish, before I put the screening in. So those are the things I'm going to have to think about next.